Principles relating to dialogue and the meaning of the other from an Quranic point of view. The second is going to be on the universal message of the Quran itself, by which I mean a message that englobes, encompasses, invigorates, and revitalizes all of the revealed messages, all of the revelations from God, all religion, in other words. That's what I mean by the universal message. And the third part will be looking at some of the inevitable objections and questions that would be made of this perspective. And I've entitled that in my book, Diatribe, Da'wah, or Dialogue. Are we engaged in mutual ostracism, in this kind of diatribe? Is it dialogue, where we're actually trying to understand each other, or is it da'wah, where we're calling people to Islam? So I'll investigate those three, inshallah, in the last part of this lecture. So to begin with, not exactly with a Quranic verse, but with a saying which is given the status of a divine utterance. That is a hadith Qudsi, a holy saying, an utterance that has come from God, but which is related by the Prophet. It's not part of the Quran, and the saying is, Kuntu kanzan makhfiyan fa'ahbabtu an u'araf fa'khalaqtu al-alam. I was a hidden treasure, and I loved to be known, so I created the world. Now this saying, I believe, contains for us the seeds of a metaphysical understanding of the principle of dialogue. It's the metaphysical archetype, let's say, or dialogue, because what we're told in this saying is that God wished to know himself. I was a hidden treasure, he said, and I loved to know myself. So I created the world. He knew himself, he knows himself in eternity and in perfection. So what he wanted to know about himself was the manifestation, outwardly, of the inner treasures that he contained in his essence. So it's a communication between different aspects of the absolute, a dialogue which is mediated by relativity. This is, I propose, the highest level at which we can understand the meaning of dialogue. God is understanding, or coming to understand and know, in distinctive, differentiated, outward, manifest mode, all of those things within himself that are indistinct, undifferentiated, absolutely infinite. So if we understand it in this way, Ibn Arabi tells us that the seeing of a thing, Ibn Arabi, the great mystic from Andalusia, to whom I'll be returning repeatedly in this presentation. Ibn Arabi says that the seeing of a thing itself in itself is different from the seeing of a thing, as it were, in another. Now here in this otherness, in this mirror, which Adam, which the first man, which the whole of the creation is for God, gives us an understanding of what the other for all of us can actually mean. The other, in its otherness, is actually an intrinsic part of self-understanding. Just as God comes to understand, know, manifest himself outwardly through an apparent other, we likewise can come to understand, know, and realize something deeper about ourselves through an apparent other. If the notion of the world coming into being springs from a desire or a love for the divine to know itself, we're told that in the Quran, we're told that the whole of the world springs likewise from in its distinct differentiation from the point of view of knowledge. And I quote from the Quran here, O mankind, truly we have created you male and female, and have made you nations and tribes that ye may know one another. Now, nations and tribes, that ye may know one another. The word here is lita'arafu, that ye may know, is a complementary, it's a mutual relationship of knowledge here. That ye may know one another. The word that I used at the beginning in the Hadith Qudsi is araf, to be known in a passive And it's related to the same root as ta'arafu, that ye may know one another. Both of them are likewise related to the word ma'rifah, spiritual knowledge. And this takes us to the essential definition of ma'rifah given to us by the Prophet, which is man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu. He who knows himself knows his Lord. So what we have here are different dimensions of knowledge. Knowledge of self, knowledge of God, and knowledge of each other. All of them complementing each other in order to arrive ultimately at the stage of Qiyuri Ma'rifah, total consciousness. The verse that I just cited, mankind being divided into tribes and nations for the sake of better knowing each other, is often cited as a kind of proof text for upholding the principle of dialogue, peaceful coexistence, and indeed it is these things. It is a proof text that upholds them. But if we understand the whole notion of knowledge of God being manifested through the other, we can understand that the import of this verse is deepened insofar as it's consciously related to the metaphysical principle that I put at the beginning. Self-knowledge through another. This creative process by which God comes to know outwardly the treasures of his own essence takes us to the heart of Tawheed, in the sense that Tawheed, all too often simplistically translated as unity, Tawheed is really the verbal noun of the second form of Arabic, wahada, to make one. Theologically it means to declare the oneness of God. But more deeply it means to establish that oneness, to make that one real within oneself, first and foremost, and not only with regard to the deity. It's an integration, taking that word in its etymological root, to make one, integrate. Now we're taken to the heart of Tawheed because in the Quran we're told, wherever you turn, there is the face of God. The whole of creation manifests the face of God, faces of God if one likes, if one takes multiplicity, but the face of God in its unitive aspect, which is multiply differentiated according to the mirrors of existence. Now, Al-Ghazali, one of the greatest authorities, both mystical and jurisprudential in our tradition, has a very illuminating exposition on this verse in his Mishkat al-Anwar. Illuminating is now a word that is in my mind because I feel as though I'm not only being illuminated but heated extremely. So if that is going to continue, with your permission, I'll take off my jacket.
So that you can become luminous.
Inshallah. Inshallah. So, he gives a very illuminating exposition of this verse in the Mishkat al-Anwar, the niche of light. He says that there's a verse in the Quran which tells us that everything is perishing except its face. Kullu shay'in halikun illa wajha. Al-Ghazali tells us that what this can mean esoterically, mystically, is that everything is in a state of perishing except the face of God within it. That is, the it goes back to the thing and not only to God. The overt meaning is everything is perishing except the face of God, except its face, his face. But he says that no, everything is in a state of evanescence, passing away, except that face of God within it that gives it life and being. So he tells us that the Sufis of the highest order, those who experience extinction, fana, are the ones who have become extinguished to their own face, the face by which they are in fact non-existent. By negating their non-existence, they open out into and realize the one and only true face, both within them and above them. Therefore, they are the ones who can see the divine face within themselves and the divine face in the other. in the neighbour. And in this apparent extinction of phenomenal multiplicity, we arrive at a vision of unity in which all multiplicity is integrated within the divine face. Now, immediately some of you may be thinking, is there not a contradiction between the unity called for by Fana, of eliminating the divine face within oneself, eliminating the specific face within oneself, and realizing the divine face? There seems to be an effacement of the very multiplicity, the differentiation, that earlier we said was divinely willed diversity and differentiation. Now, the way of resolving this apparent contradiction is to realize what I said earlier about the fact that everything in existence from the Sufi point of view is a mirror or a locus, a mazhar, for the dhuhr of God's self-manifestation, is tajalli. So an apparent effacement of multiplicity on the surface is in fact a reintegration of multiplicity in depth, so that one comes to see and appreciate the divine face in everything. And one of the contentions I make in my book in a more elaborate manner is that the notion we have in Islam of adab, of courtesy, etiquette, politeness, and so on, all of these modes of being polite to each other, to the neighbour, to the other, all of these aspects of Muslim culture are taken to an extreme, if you like, by the Sufis, who have understood that the deepest reason for being polite and kind and generous and neighbourly is in fact not to conform to some outward social convention, but to conform to the requirements of bringing the potential sanctity of every person to whom you're speaking into actualization. To help the sanctity of each person, the divinity ultimately, but the sanctity certainly, of each of the people to whom we're speaking at all times, to help bring that into actuality. Here we have a kind of dialogue which goes far beyond the confines defined by pluralism. Rather than religious pluralism, which I haven't got time to go into in this lecture, but which I criticise towards the end of my book, pluralism is put forward as a sort of set of rules or requirements that we should conform to. But this view of unity and of diversity is one in which an organic awareness of the sanctity of all of creation, and in particular nations and tribes and other religions that we encounter, is brought to fruition. Ghazali says that one doesn't have to experience the grace of annihilation, of fana, totally, in order to arrive at this position. He says that one way is dhawqan, through taste, and another way is through irfan and ilmiya, through cognitive knowledge. In other words, even if we only have an intellectual or conceptual assimilation of the principles that I've been speaking about, it should give rise, the effacement that is the pinnacle of fana, it should give rise within each individual to a sense of the need for humility before the divine reality, and that humility that dissolves all of the coagulations and egocentricities that prevent us from reaching out and opening up to the other. So what results from this apprehension of Tawheed is a spiritual discernment, a discernment about one's own nothingness before the divine, and a discernment that goes hand in hand with that of the potential holiness and sanctity of the other. Now, I'm going to move to the second part of the lecture, which I've entitled The Universal Meaning of Islam from the Quranic point of view. Let me start by saying that Islam, in the time in which the Quran was revealed, would have been understood in its etymological and not communal sense. Islam meaning submission, universal submission. The communal sense of being affiliated and having allegiance to a community that's different from other revealed faiths came much later. But the original meaning of Islam, and is still today, Islam in the sense of universal submission, and a Muslim is one who submits. There are many verses which uphold this interpretation, this continuing validity of this interpretation, among which I'll just quote this. Seek they other than the religion of God, Deen Allah, when unto him submitteth whosoever is in the heavens and the earth, willingly or unwillingly. In other words, the religion of God here is equated with this universal submission. Everything in heaven and in earth submits unto God willingly or unwillingly. And what is it then that makes the religion of God specifically human in its application? It's the willingness of the human being to submit. To understand this religion of God, which is distinct from the notion of Islam as a specific revelation, but is at one with the total reality of submission in the universe. This meaning, the meaning of the religion of God, is brought out by one of the greatest commentators of the Quran in the school of Ibn Arabi, Abdul Razak al-Kashani, lived in the 14th century. I'm going to use much of his commentary to help us to explore these verses and to bring out their deeper meanings. He comments as follows on the verse which declares that the religion that was given to the Prophet Muhammad is the same religion which was bestowed upon his predecessors. The quote is this, it's from the Quran. He hath ordained for you of the religion, min ad-din, that which he commended unto Noah, and that which we revealed to thee, speaking to the Prophet, and that which we commended unto Abraham and Moses and Jesus, saying, establish the religion, and be not divided therein. Now, Kashani comments as follows. He hath ordained for you of the religion, this is from the Quran, and then he says, that is the absolute religion, ad-din al-mutlaq, which God has charged all of the prophets to establish, and to be unanimous, not divided with regard to it. Now he explains what this is. This is the principle and the root of religion, ad-din, by which the prophets differentiate this one root according to what is beneficial in different situations, such as prescriptions of acts of obedience, worship, and social intercourse. Of course, he's saying they do this in accordance with divine revelation, but the differentiation that occurs is on the basis of one which means both root and principle. And then he quotes a verse which I'll come back to later, inshallah. For each we have appointed from you a law and a way. As I say, I'll come back to that verse later, but for now, this difference between the absolute or the unconditional, mutlaq has both of these meanings, absolute and unconditional. The difference between this absolute religion and the various forms that this one religion can take is then described by Kashani in terms of immutability, changelessness. That's the key note of this absolute religion. It does not change. It cannot change. If it changes, it's not the absolute religion. So the right religion, he says, ad-din al-qayyim, relating to another verse of the Quran, is tied to that which is immutable. Ma la yataghayyar, that which has no ghayr, it doesn't alter. Within knowledge and action. These are the two essential dimensions within which immutability is established. Ilm and amal, knowledge and action. The revealed law, the Sharia, on the other hand, is tied to that which does alter. It alters in respect to rules and conditions. On the one hand, we have an immutable religion, and on the other, various revealed laws that change according to time and place. Now, this immutable religion, the religion that doesn't change, is dynamically related to that which does not change in the human being, namely the fitrah, the primordial human nature. There is one key verse in which the fitrah is described, and Kashani did just a very interesting commentary on that. Now, that verse is in the Surah Al-Rum, and it's verse 30. So set thy purpose for the religion, again it's in the singular, aqim wajhaka lid-din hanifa, with pure devotion. Fitrat Allah, the nature of God, fitrat Allah. This has various interpretations as well. Is it the original nature of God, or the original nature of man that's created by God and therefore belongs to God? There's a debate in that in Sufism, but for now that doesn't concern us. It's the fitra that God established for man. Its inner identity with the divine is another matter, which we can establish through the simple saying that God created man according to his own surah. Inna Allaha khalaqa Adama ala suratihi. But that's another question. I won't go into that here. Set thy purpose for the religion, or for religion, as one with pure devotion. The nature of God, fitrat Allah, possessing this fitra of Allah, according to which He has created man. There is no altering God's creation. That is the right religion, ad-din al-qayyim that we had earlier. But most men know not. So now we've got a stress on the immutability of the divine creation, which is munasib, which has an affinity with the immutability of the human fitra. Now Kashani comments on this fitra. Set thy purpose then for the religion of Tawheed, and that is the path to the real, the path to al-haq. Or, he says, religion in the absolute sense. Again, we have ad-din mutlaqan, religion in the unconditional sense. That which is other than this is an important point. That which is other than this religion is not religion, he says, because of its separation from the attainment of the goal. So what he's saying here is that the only thing that we can truly refer to as religion in the absolute and unconditional sense is this deen of the fitrah, the deen that is of Tawheed. All other religions are therefore unreal as religion in a certain respect. And I say in a certain respect because in another respect, from the point of view of time, place and relativity, Kashani and all of the Sufis in this tradition of the Wahdat al-Wujud school are adamant that the only way of having access to this pure, unadulterated, unconditional religion is through following faithfully the prescriptions of one religion. And for all of them, of course, that one religion will be Islam in the specific sense. I'll come to this point towards the end of my lecture. But for now it's important to stress that that which is true or absolute or unconditional religion is this religion that cannot be subject to change. And the logic is very clear. That which is subject to change cannot be absolute. When we're talking about religion then, anything that changes must pertain to the relative dimension of the religion. To continue with the commentary, Kashani describes those who are called Hanif as being those who, quote, cleave to the fitrah, which is the state in accordance with which the reality of humanity was created. Eternal purity and disengagement. And this is the right religion. Again, we have ad-din al-qayyim. This is the right religion, the upright religion, you might say as well. In eternity without beginning or end, never altering or being differentiated from that original purity or that intrinsic primordial tawheed. Now, this fitrah, which he describes as being the result of the most holy effusion of God, the fayd al-aqdas, it crystallizes, if you like, the pattern, the original perfect and immutable pattern of every human being, crystallizes at the very outset of the creation in what is called the fayd al-aqdas, the most holy effusion of being. This cannot change, and no one who is true to this fitrah can be veiled from God by the phenomena of the world. The fitrah enables you to see God everywhere and in everything. There's a hadith of the Prophet in which it said that every baby is born according to the fitrah, and its parents make the baby a Jew, a Christian, or a Magian. Now, he doesn't say that every baby is born as a Muslim here. He says according to the fitrah, and that's important. Because what the rest of the hadith says is that the parents, or let's say conditioning generally, the society, the environment, establishes the nature of the formal religious affiliation. But Kashani says in his commentary here that this does not mean that the fitra can change. All it means is that the religion is a superimposition upon a basic infrastructure, let's say a religious superimposition on a spiritual infrastructure that is inalterable. And then he finishes his commentary by saying, this is the meaning of his words, there is no altering in God's creation. That is the right religion, but most men know not. So what we're given here is a conception of the primordial nature of the human being as being that within us which is not only receptive to the transcendent realities and truths of revelation, but also receptive to the fitra in other human beings. It is the constitutional, or let's say spiritual affinity that we have within us to the truths of revelation. And without this fitra being in place, none of the truths or realities of revelation would make any sense. It's on the basis of this fitra that we're able to affirm that revelation is indeed revelation and nothing else. Ultimately, this fitra transforms spiritual affinity with revelation into mystical unity with God. And for Kashani and for Al-Ghazali, as we saw, the deepest meaning of submission of Islam is extinction, it is fana. But short of that, we have what I've said here, an understanding that as human beings we are all related to one divine principle. Now this fitra informs the human soul in a more fundamental way than the forms of outward religion. It is the religion of the fitra. Islam puts itself forward as the religion of the fitra. Kashani and Ibn Arabi and Ghazali and Rumi and all of the Sufis that I looked at, and all the ones I didn't in fact, would affirm that Islam in a particular sense is the religion that resonates most harmoniously with that fitra. None of them would say anything else. The implications of this will be clear in the last part of my talk. But what matters here is that the breath of God that is breathed into the soul, together with the fitra, is that which gives rise within each soul to the possibility of recognizing the divine reality above and beyond us, the possibility of recognizing revelation, and the possibility of recognizing, affirming, and revering the sanctity in our fellow human beings. So just as this primordial fitra, this universal consciousness, doesn't belong to any one of us, it's pre-personal, it's total and universal, so it allows us to see that all revelation that has come from God is indeed from God. It sounds tautologist, but it is that within us, the fitra enables us to see that there is nothing in the revelations by God to other religious communities that contradicts this fitra. What may contradict the fitra is various applications and interpretations and institutional developments on the basis of the revelation that would be in contradiction with the fitra. But it enables us to see that the basic sources of the revealed religions are indeed from God. On the basis of the fitra that we can make that affirmation and maintain it with conviction. Now this universal guidance comes to the heart of the lecture, the universal message of the Quran. That in the Quran which tells us that all revelation is from God and that we have a duty and a right to affirm the divine nature of those revelations. One of these verses is as follows. We're told in the Quran to say, we believe in God and that which is revealed unto us, that is the Muslims, and that which is revealed unto Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac and Jacob and the tribes, and that which was given unto Moses and Jesus and the prophets from their Lord. We make no distinction between any of them, meaning between any of these prophets, and unto him, unto God, we have submitted. Then comes a verse immediately afterwards that says, whoso seeketh a religion other than Islam, it will not be accepted from him, and he will be a loser in the hereafter. So how do we understand this verse that immediately comes after this affirmation of the totality of previous revelations? In a narrow sense, in a theological sense, it would be affirmed that Islam here in this verse number 85 in the Surah Al-Imran means that only Islam in the specific sense, the last Sharia revealed to the last prophet, only that is the religion acceptable to God. But from a spiritual point of view, a deeper point of view, we can understand the meaning of Islam here. Whoso seeketh a religion other than Islam, as it was defined in the previous verse, namely, everything that was revealed to Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and the tribes was given to Moses and Jesus, and the prophets, Nabiyyun min Rabbihim. La nufarriqu bayna ahadin minhum. We do not make any distinction between these prophets. So we can understand Islam to have this connotation, encompassing all of the revelations that were given to all of the prophets prior to the last prophet. Therefore, Islam is one religion, one revelation, which comprises multiple facets. It's not as if we have multiple religions. It is the one religion that has many facets. All the believers come together on the basis of this one religion. The universality of this guidance, the universality of the message of the Quran, is affirmed in verses such as the following as well. For every community, ummah, there is a messenger. In other words, no community has ever existed that has not had its messenger. Verily, another verse, verily we have sent messengers before thee. Among them are those about whom we have told thee, and those about whom we have not told thee. So in other words, we don't just have to restrict our understanding of religion and revelation to those prophets about whom mention is made in the Quran. It opens up the vista of revelations to all of the communities that we have any knowledge of. Another verse, we sent no messenger before thee, but that we inspired him, saying, there is no God save me, so worship me. The essence of the message was one and the same. And again, nothing is said unto thee, O Muhammad, but what was said to the messengers before thee. What do we have here? Again, an affirmation that the essential message of religion cannot alter, cannot fluctuate. It is the same thing that was said to the last prophet as it was said to all of the previous prophets. So what can that same thing be other than Tawheed, other than the deen of the fitrah, other than the affirmation of ultimate reality and a conformity to that ultimate reality? This conception of essential religion, or religion as such, doesn't obliterate the differences between the revelations. This is a very important point, because diversity is not a regrettable event. It was willed by the divine, as we had earlier. That God said he wished to be known, he loved to be known. He said in the Quran that he divided us into tribes and nations in order that we may know each other. So diversity is divinely ordained, and each person has it incumbent upon him to follow one particular path. It's impossible to follow any given series of paths up a particular mountain. One has to follow one and abide by its dictates. The Quran tells us in one of the most important verses in this connection, part of which I quoted earlier, for each we have appointed from you a law and a way. لِكُلٍّ جَعَلْنَا مِنْكُمْ شِرْعَةً وَمِنْهَاجًا. Had God willed, he would have made you one community. لَجَعَلَكُمْ أُمَّةً وَاحِدَةً. He could have made you one ummah, but he willed otherwise, that he might try you by that which he has given you. So vie with one another in good works. Unto God ye all will return, and he will inform you of that wherein ye differed. So the meaning of the verse is absolutely clear, but let's go into the commentary that Kashani gives for us. Had God willed, he could have made all of you one community. His comment comes. Realizers of oneness, realizers in the sense of muhaqqiq, those who actually make real the one. In accordance with the fitrah, being in agreement upon a single religion. But he willed to manifest to you that which he gave you. According to your preparedness, according to your isti'dad, according to the receptivity that each of you as communities possesses. Why? So that the perfections may become variegated. They have tanawwu, they have different types. That's why he gave different revelations to different communities who have different degrees of preparedness for the sake of manifesting differing perfections, all of which are rooted in the one and absolute perfection, that of Allah Ta'ala. So he says, continuing with his commentary, vie with one another in good works. That is, amongst those things which connect you with your perfection. In other words, those works that are given in each of the different religions, according to Kashani, are those which connect you with your perfection. Those which bring forth your perfection from potentiality into actuality. And this causes you to attain nearness to him, and it brings your perfection into actuality from latency. Although the fitra is one, the perfections therefore latent within that oneness are variegated. And these human communities, which are diverse, can therefore be seen as prolongations. All of them are prolongations of that basic fitra in different modes. They are, as it were, different treasures, different jewels comprised within the hidden treasure. Remember the saying at the outset, I was a hidden treasure and I loved to be known, and so I created the world. This loving to be known of each of these treasures, the religions can be understood, in Kashani's perspective, as being particularly striking jewels within that treasure, refulgent jewels that make manifest something of that treasure. If we understand religion in terms of nuzul, descent, and realization in terms of su'ud, ascent, we could say that these religions are like so many jewels within that treasure that have come down in order to actualize the ascent, the su'ud of individuals and communions of souls, communities, to help them to realize their perfection. And in doing so, assist or participate in the very process by which God comes to understand and know himself in outward differentiated mode. I stress that because it sounds scandalous to say that God comes to understand and comes to know himself. But one of the meanings of Al-Khabir, the one who is aware in an informed sense, is that he is aware of absolutely everything that happens as it happens. And this is distinct from his knowledge of all things in their eternal state within the essence. So God's knowledge is both infinite, inward and eternal, but it's also outward in accordance with the rhythms of manifestation. And the return of manifestation to the essence is the process by which the hidden treasure comes to be known and loved. Just to make that point a bit more clearly. In another very important verse, we're given a succinct definition of what this essential, unchangeable religion is. It says, truly those who believe, those who are Jews, those who are Christians, and the Sabians, whoever believeth in God and the last day and is virtuous, surely their reward is with their Lord, no fear shall come upon them, neither shall they grieve. Now this relates back to a point we made earlier, that we don't know about all of the prophets. They're not all mentioned in the Quran. What we have in this verse is at the beginning of what you might say is a comprehensive list. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَالَّذِينَ هَادُوا وَالنَّصَارَى وَالسَّابِئِينَ مَنْ آمَنَ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ. It doesn't then go on and tell us all of the religious communities. It says those who believe in this revelation, the Muslims, and the Christians and the Jews and the Sabians. And then there's a universal category. Man amana billah wal yawm al-akhir. Whoever believes in God and the Day of Judgment. Wa amila salihat. And acts righteously. So here we have a universal category based on faith in an absolute, however defined, faith in a hereafter to which we're accountable, the last day, and action that is consequent upon those two beliefs. Virtuous action. So, faith allied to virtue are given here as, from a Quranic point of view, the quintessential religion. What we heard earlier is the immutable religion, and we heard Kashani saying that the immutable religion is that which alters not in respect of ilm and amal. Here we have ilm, the knowledge of the absolute, and amal, consequent action thereupon. Now, although this verse is clearly of universalist import, there are commentators in the tradition, and the majority of them, one has to say, the majority of the early commentators regard this verse as being abrogated by the verse that we had earlier, those who seek a religion other than Islam, it will not be accepted from them. They will be losers in the hereafter. However, Tabari, one of the most important early commentators of the Quran, stands out as an exception. He maintains that this verse cannot be subject to abrogation. Those verses which are subject to abrogation are those which pertain to commands and prohibitions, not to promises. Where God promises that those who believe, and those who are Christians and Jews and Sabians, and whoever believes in God and their judgment and acts virtuously, when he promises that these people will get their reward from their Lord and no fear or grief will be upon them, Tabari maintains emphatically that this verse cannot be subject to application. Well, I don't know about emphatically, that's me being emphatic. I should qualify that and say that Tabari goes through all of the earlier commentators and says this is what they say, and this is what Ibn Abbas says about this verse. But I, for one, say this. And he puts that at the end of his comment, so I'm the one who's being emphatic. So this verse tells us that salvation cannot be the monopoly of Islam in a narrow sense. It is, salvation is all-inclusive, consequent upon these two criteria, faith and virtue. The Quran is, in fact, unique amongst all the world scriptures for not only mentioning explicitly other religions in its founding scripture, which you don't find in any other founding scripture at all, but also in the way in which it extends salvation to all of these religious communities as a possibility. The attitude promoted by this inclusivist definition of salvation is strengthened by a whole series of other verses in the Quran which are much more explicit in their denunciation of the opposite, namely religious nationalism, religious exclusivism, religious bigotry and narrow-mindedness. I'll give you a few examples of those verses. And they say, none entereth paradise unless he be a Jew or a Christian. This is relating to a dogmatic position held by the Jews and Christians at that time. No one enters paradise unless they're Jews or Muslims or Christians. The Quran says, these are their own vain desires. The word is amani, the plural of umniya. These are their vain desires. Say to them, bring your proof if you're truthful. What evidence do you have for such a claim? In other words. And it goes on. Nay, but whosoever submitted his purpose to God, man aslama wajhahu lillah. It doesn't say man kana muslim, bima'na khas or something like that. It says he who submits his purpose, his essence, his face, standing for all these things. He who submits himself to God, man aslama wajhahu lillah, fahuwa muhsin, and he is virtuous. He has that beauty of soul, in fact, because muhsin really does relate to the root of husn, and ihsan is being more appropriately translated into English these days as making beautiful, rather than just as being virtuous. Virtue being, in the words of Richard Schumann, virtue being inward beauty, just as beauty is inward virtue. Beauty is outward virtue. So it doesn't contradict the exclusivist claims of the Christians and the Jews with an exclusivism of its own. It doesn't say, no, say to the Christians and Jews, you're wrong, we're right, it's only Muslims who go to paradise and you're all damned. It doesn't say that. It says that this group that is open to salvation is universalized. It's not what you say, and it's not what we say that only we may be, as narrow Muslims in a narrow sense. It says all of those who have faith and who have virtue have access to salvation, dependent, of course, on divine grace. So it's perfectly justified to argue that the verse doesn't respond in kind to exclusivism of the Jews or the Christians. It responds how? On a metaphysical or supra-theological plane. By saying that it's not partisan allegiances, it's not communal definitions, it's not denominational labels that are attached to you that will determine your state in hereafter. It's the degree of your faith, the sincerity of your faith, and the action that is consequent upon it. Those are the elements that attract the divine rahmah and the divine grace that alone allows souls to enter paradise. This supra-confessional conception is also affirmed in the following 3 verses. The Quran says, "It will not be in accordance with your desires." Now it's addressing Muslims. It will not be in accordance with your desires. The same word is used, amani, as was used for the Christians and Jews. It will not be in accordance with your desires, nor the desires of the people of the Scripture. Now what is it that's being spoken of here? He who doth wrong will have the recompense thereof, and will not find, apart from God, any protecting friend or helper. Here we have an affirmation of divine justice. If you do wrong, you will have the recompense for it. But whoever does good works, whether male or female, and is a believer, such will enter paradise, and will not be wronged the dint of a datestone, a speck on a datestone. In other words, the justice of God is absolutely faultless, and it will not be in accordance with partisan desires or sentimental affiliations. We will only go to paradise, or they. It's on a much higher level, relating directly to the divine justice. Then we have the verse, "Who is better in religion than he who submitteth his purpose to God?" Again, same phrase, "Man aslama wajhahu lillah," this time. And while being virtuous, following the religious community of Abraham the upright. The justice of God therefore goes beyond all of these sentimental desires and exclusivist affirmations. If the Muslim maintains that only he and only his co-religionists, in a narrow sense, go to paradise, then he, in good Quranic logic, falls into exactly the same trap into which the Christians and the Jews fall, insofar as they claim exclusive access to paradise. So it's not only spiritually unjust to claim exclusivism for one's own religion, it's also purely and simply illogical from the point of view of the Quranic verses we've been looking at. Another verse which is important in this connection. "And they say, be Jews or Christians, then you will be rightly guided. Say, nay, but we are of the religious community of Abraham the devout, and he was not an idolater." Now the import of this verse is clear. Again, it's saying that Jews and Christians are misguided insofar as they say only we are guided. Kashani brings out the import of this verse very clearly. "And they say, be Christians or Jews, each is veiled by his religion, claiming that the real is identified with their religion only, and no other. Say instead," now he's quoting the Quran again, "we are of the religious community of Abraham." His commentary, "For truly absolute guidance, al-huda al-mutlaq," again, absolute, unconditional, is Tawheed, which comprises, and this is extremely important, Tawheed comprises, the word used is shamil, comprises all religions, and it lifts every veil. As God says in his words, and then he quotes a verse of the Quran which we had earlier, that we believe in God and all of the prophets from Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael onwards. We make no distinction between any of them. Kashani says, "We don't make distinction between the prophets by negating the religion of some and affirming the religion of others. Rather, we declare that all of them, all religions and all prophets, are brought together within the real, within al-Haq. And they are all concordant with Tawheed. All religions are transcribed by Tawheed, which comprises all of them. If they believe in the like of that which ye believe, that is, if the Christians and Jews believe in that which you Muslims believe, that is Tawheed, which brings together every religion and every creed, then they are rightly guided in the absolute or non-delimited state of right guidance. But if they turn away, they are taking sides in religions. They're falling into this partisanship, splitting up the guidance and causing you to be divided with regard to it." Now here Kashani is echoing a very well-known principle in Ibn Arabi's Watat al-Wujud. that you must not be bound up by the particularities of your own beliefs, but make yourself a receptive substance to the beliefs of all peoples. In his Tajmal al-Ashwaq, the most famous poem in this regard is of course one that most of you are probably familiar with, but my heart has become capable of every form. لَقَدْ صَارَ قَلْبِي قَابِلًا كُلَّ سُورَةٍ. My heart has become capable of every form. And then he says, it's a pasture for gazelles, and it's the tables of the Torah, it's the Kaaba of the pilgrims, the tablets, the Mus'haf of the Quran, the scripts of the Quran. And then he says, I follow the religion of love. Adinu bidin al-hubb. I follow the religion of love. Anna tawajjahat rakayibuhu faddinu dini wa imani. I follow the religion of love. Whichever way its camels may take, that is my religion and that is my faith. Now this openness to the revealed substance of all the faiths comes about as a result of the deepening of what the substance of one's own consciousness. Ibn Arabi, of course, says this, but he continues by saying that Islam, in the specific sense, as it was revealed to the Prophet, the last revelation, let's say, of Islam, is the one that is to be followed. It is normative, and I hope I will have time to come to that at the end of this lecture. He quotes the great exoteric authority, Bukhari, as saying that religion is one. Now, Bukhari, of course, has the most important collection of hadith to his name, and he has a chapter heading which says, hadiths that have come pertaining to the fact that religion is one. Ibn Arabi comments, it is that religion of Tawheed concerning which Bukhari wrote a chapter. He brought the article which makes the word religion, deen, definite, because all religion comes from God, even if some of the rulings are diverse. Everyone, Ibn Arabi says, is commanded to perform the religion and to come together in it. So here we have, the essence of the religion is that it is revealed and we have to submit to it. Of course, in the deeper aspects of this perspective, this submission means extinction, and the conformity to the religion means the plumbing of the depths, both of the doctrine and of the practice, and the actualization of the grace that's inherent in the revealed message. But from our point of view, what really matters here is that the substance of religion is one and immutable. The rulings are diverse. That is the expression, the Sufi expression of the oneness of religion in the Quran that we have been attempting to explore in these last few essays, in these last few sections. Now, for the final part, I hope I have about 15 minutes left for this. Is that all right? Just to look a little bit at the objections that would be raised by this perspective. As I've said more than once, the Sufis mentioned here would all uphold the normativity of Islam, by which I mean Islam is the religion that people should follow. It's not just prescriptive, it's normative as well. One has to abide by it. And does this contradict the acceptance of all faiths that is implied in our universal view of Islam? That's the first objection. The second, is there not a contradiction between the traditional imperative of da'wah, inviting people to Islam, calling people to Islam, and the requirements of contemporary dialogue, where that kind of da'wah and that invitation and so on and so forth are regarded as products of a long-gone age. So regarding the first objection, here I want to bring in a little bit of the metaphysics of Ibn Arabi, just as a background to responding to this objection. The objection, to give you in a nutshell, is universality versus particularity. If we believe in the universality of religions, how do we uphold the particularity of our practice? Now, Ibn Arabi metaphysics on being can be summed up in one very important sentence. Part of the perfection of being, wujud, is the existence of imperfection within it. If this were not the case, the perfection of being would become imperfect, by virtue of the absence of imperfection within it. It's a complicated and condensed sentence. And for those of you who know Arabic, it's also very beautiful. من كمال الوجود وجود النقص فيه وإذ لو لم يكن لكان كمال الوجود ناقصا لعدم وجود النقص فيه. In other words, for being to be perfect or complete, it has to comprise an element of imperfection or incompleteness. Otherwise, something would be left out, incompleteness. So it has to include it. Now we can apply this inclusivity of exclusion to the religious phenomenon as well, and say that a truly inclusivist perspective must of necessity comprise an element of exclusivity, failing which it excludes exclusion and becomes therefore exclusivist. To be truly inclusivist, you have to also have an element of exclusivism. And this is the role played by the particularity of the path that's followed by these great Sufis, who, in one and the same breath can talk about the universal vision of religion, and at the same time, as Rumi did, some of the most wonderful verses in the Masnavi, and the Kitab Fiqh in his discourses. He can affirm at one and the same time the fact that the religion of truth, the religion of love, is above and beyond all religions. He can sing, as he does in one of his ghazals, that I what do you make of this, O Muslims, that I do not even recognize myself? I don't know myself. He says I'm neither a Muslim, nor a Jew, nor a Christian, nor of the East, nor of the West, and so on and so forth. So he excludes all of these particularities for the sake of the universal. But at the same time, Sayyid Jalaluddin Rumi, in his Kitab Fihi Ma Fihi, can actually make an invitation to a Christian and say to him, Jarrah, why do you not enter the religion of Islam? Well, we have in Islam everything that you have in Christianity. How can we reconcile this apparent contradiction between universality of spiritual vision and particularity of Islamic practice? I suggest that we can reconcile the two by making them actually part of an authentic universalism, which comprises and does not exclude particularism. Secondly, we can do so by saying that the very universality of Islam is one of the best ways in which we can call people to Islam. If we are more, let's say, attached to the imperative of da'wah, let's say as Muslims, the overwhelming majority of practicing Muslims feel that part of their duty is to bear witness to their faith, as of course to all people who have any degree of conviction with regard to their faith, that they have a duty to bear witness to it, to make manifest this gift that they have been given for the sake of others to share and participate in it. So if that is the predominant note for dialogue amongst majoritarian upholders of Muslim community, if that is the predominant note, then I would suggest one way of introducing a note of universality into that dialogue of da'wah is to say that in an age which is dominated by the opposition between religion and atheism, now it could be argued we're in an age dominated by the opposition between religious fundamentalism and religion. But religion and atheism are still two very antagonistic poles that we're contending with. In an age dominated by an antagonism between religion and atheism, and at a time when secularism appears to be the only ideological antidote to the bigotry associated both with atheism and with religion. In such an age, it is the most effective way for a Muslim who feels he must make da'wah. The most effective means of making this da'wah is to say, look at this religion, look at this Quran, which is unique in affirming all true religions. In other words, it's the very universality of the Quran which affirms, confirms, validates, and invigorates, you might say, all of the religions from within. As the Quran says, the Quran is there as a confirmation of what came before it, and a custodian over it, it's a preserver of it. All of this can be presented in dialogue as a call to Islam. It may not satisfy the requirements of contemporary dialogical schemas where da'wah is not allowed, but I would say that if we restrict dialogue only to those who are already liberals or already universalists, already convinced of the need to engage in dialogue, then you're cutting off all of those people who actually cannot enter into any kind of dialogue unless they see it as a kind of da'wah. So make that da'wah a universalist one which can say to Christians and Jews that we invite you to consider this religion, but if you do not enter into it, our religion is the only one which actually gives you not only legal protection, but reverence as well. Muslims are instructed in the Quran to fight. In fact, the first verse that was revealed in this connection was in fact one which said, if God did not give permission to fight, then mosques and churches and synagogues and places wherein God's name is remembered much, these places would be torn down. So Muslims are instructed to fight and die if necessary for the protection of these places of worship belonging to other religions. Of course, many Muslims would say the other religions are abrogated and so on and so forth. They would say their books have been subject to tahrif, they've been altered. These arguments, of course, will take some time to go into in some detail, but in essence, we can reply in the following two ways. If the book in question were completely distorted, if it contained no spiritual value, if it was so doubtful, the book of the Christians and the Jews, that it no longer possessed any effective guidance, then it's completely illogical for Muslims to refer to them as people of the book. It's completely illogical for them to preserve their places of worship and so on and so forth. And it would be absurd